Most governments across the globe should be looking at increasing the amount of automation in the public sector and seeing how they can do more with less, because that's a direct impact into the taxes you pay. There's a very big opportunity for startups in this space because enterprise users of the technology, they don't move nearly as fast as the way the technology has been moving. So when you think about
parents still being a decision maker of what their child should study this and that to get this and that, that's bullshit. Good evening, Kevin. I can't wait for this. I need to be frank that I don't have much knowledge yet regarding the field of VC and startup, but I always have an eagerness to solve my curiosity on it. The questions today might sound a little bit controversial, but I just want to have a great conversation and having fun around with it. So much appreciated on joining me.
Yeah, happy to be here. Happy to get into the discussion. Looking forward to it.
I always love to start from a little time travel. Kevin, take us back to the beginning. What was the journey that led you from where you started and all the way building and backing companies in Southeast Asia and ultimately calling Malaysia home?
Sure. So I'll do the quick version so that I don't get too tied down into the details. I'm originally from the US, but I'm from like a very sort of middle of nowhere place. You basically draw a bullseye over the country, and I'm nearly right in the middle of there. But the moment that I could, I ended up getting out. And so fast forward to the education side, I did my MBA in New Jersey, and I came out at probably the worst time for somebody that was coming out with a finance degree, which was 2008, right in the financial crisis. Everybody's doing layoffs. It's a terrible time. I somehow ended up getting lucky enough in order to get a job on Wall Street. But I absolutely hated it. So I did not last very long. And while everyone's getting fired, I made the decision to actually quit, which was probably not the smartest thing. But I did it anyways. I found my way from there into a company called Tiger Capital, which was doing distress, turnarounds, advisory, etc. So it was quite interesting. There was a lot of activity. It was extremely high volume, but ultimately ended up leaving there, switched over to another global fund, and ultimately over my career, I just kept on moving earlier and earlier stage and more international. That led me to a point to where, subsequent to there, I moved to another fund, and from a career progression standpoint, it was pretty good because I'm hanging out in the headquarter office. We've got 17 funds across 19 countries. I was on top of the global ones, and I basically managed the managers on the regional or country specific ones. But it was missing the fun part of actually dealing with companies. So ultimately, I left that one, took another role at another global fund, but that was to run Latin America. So I was living in Mexico at the time. And what happened was that the woman that was running Asia went on maternity leave. And so since I knew the region and I'm new to the organization, I throw my hand up and volunteer. But ultimately, she never came back to take over that portfolio. For essentially a year straight, I was running the two sides of the planet that are a flip of the AM/PM. And I was flying back and forth. It was essentially like 2 weeks here, 2 weeks there, country hopping in between. I make the joke that my wife forgot what I look like because I was traveling so often. And so ultimately I said, okay, I got to choose one. And I ended up deciding on coming out to Asia because that's where a lot of our portfolio growth was. It's where I saw a lot of opportunity. And settling down in Malaysia specifically was just a pragmatic decision, which was really based upon the connectivity of the airport, ease of settling in, cost of living, those sort of niceties. Because again, I'm in a role where I travel a lot. So I just need like a home base to come back to and a good place for the family. So it tick marked all those boxes. And then you fast forward a couple of years, and ultimately, at the very end of 2021, I decided to launch Indelible Ventures, which is my own fund. It's a seed stage VC based in Malaysia, but investing across Southeast Asia. And we target specifically B2B tech, and even more specifically, those where we see that there's an international expansion opportunity. And the reason for launching that in the first place was because when you look across Southeast Asia, there's this really big gap in the market. For a while, a lot of the regional firms were really truly regional. But then, for whatever reason, around, say, call it 2018, the entirety of the Southeast Asia ecosystem seemed like it pivoted to an Indonesia only or an Indonesia plus Singapore strategy. And you saw a lot of the capital disappear from other markets. There was a market impact in Malaysia at the same time. You saw similar happening in Thailand and Philippines, that a lot of those players just stopped paying attention because they were on the same train of that strategy and focus. And so from a geographic standpoint, there was a gap. From a stage of financing, there's a gap because what happened was a lot of those same funds were essentially victims of their own success because they raised subsequent funds and they raised larger funds. And so because now they have larger amount of capital, they want to write larger size checks because it no longer makes sense with the amount of capital that they have to write those small numbers. So now all of a sudden you have a lot of like A and B, series A and B players, but you don't have as many seed stage players or like those first check writers. And so that was essentially a gap in the market that I was seeing in regards to geography and stage. And I also saw that, the standard evolution of a startup ecosystem is that generally it starts with consumer tech. You get your e-commerce players, you get some social media, you get your payment rails for consumer. But then after that, for all of the rest of the businesses to kind of keep pace, the B2B side of technology needs to come in. And I viewed Southeast Asia as kind of at that tipping point. So those three factors combined were really what motivated me to finally say, okay, I'm going to launch my own firm, and hence the creation of Indelible Ventures.
Yeah, such a quite insightful sharing regarding your journey and what drives you to launch Indelible Ventures that you mentioned about the gap and the phenomena we are facing within our ecosystem. We will discuss more details regarding this later on. I come along with some questions that we will deep down on that. So your expertise in your past experience before landing on Southeast Asia is more on corporate finance field or so-called secondary markets. I wanted to ask how much is the expertise has shaped and helped your way in approaching venture capital?
So I guess first off, I never did it worked in secondaries. And I wouldn't necessarily call what I did corporate finance. I never worked inside of a corporation. I was always on the investor and fund side. But I think my past experiences shaped my viewpoint because, I've seen thousands and thousands of companies across the globe. Through the funds that I've worked with, we've had portfolios of over 150, maybe closer to 200 plus companies. In Indelible Ventures, we've done 15 so far because we're just getting started. And what that gives is, because it's always been operationally heavy from the investor role in all of these companies, it gives it a unique insight across a broad range of industries and sectors and geographies. So when I'm looking and trying to analyze up and coming B2B tech, I have a unique frame of viewpoint because I've seen so many different companies from the inside out across industry, across geographies. So it gives a better indication of understanding whether there's product market fit. Is it a vitamin or a painkiller? Those sort of determinants that help me judge whether or not there's a market for the product.
Let's dive into the startup ecosystem. So I would like to start. Landing in Southeast Asia must come with a mix of curiosity and assumptions. So I would like to ask how your perspective on startup ecosystem here in Malaysia in particular has changed before your landing and after.
I think my viewpoint on Malaysia is has been fairly consistent. Um, I think the main change has been more on the exhaustion side of the equation, because Malaysia offers a number of characteristics that would indicate that it should provide an optimal starting point for entrepreneurs and for startups. All of this tells me that there's a big opportunity in the market. Now, the ecosystem has had a tendency of coming in waves, meaning that there's not a consistent year on year production of a quantity of quality startups. They generally get grouped into, we'll call it cohort years, is usually the way that I describe it, where you can kind of cluster the startups into, your 2012 cohort, your 2016 cohort, your 2018 cohort, and these sort of characteristics. The challenge that the ecosystem has faced is really it's gotten in its own way, from my opinion. And that's one of the reasons why it hasn't been able to consistently produce. I'm not necessarily saying go full blown kind of manufactured environment, which is a little bit more of the way that Singapore has been able to generate its own. It's got some natural inherent characteristics because of the concentration of capital talent, and some other benefits that it has. But there's a number of things that could be done here in order to improve the ecosystem. The challenge, as I referenced before, is that over time, it's not necessarily that my viewpoint has changed, it's just the exhaustion of it not getting there.
Let's be blunt for a moment. From your lens as a venture capitalist, underlying with what you just mentioned just now, what is fundamentally might holding back Malaysia's startup ecosystem might operating in such inefficiencies way? Is it the capital? Is it the talent, or is it something deeper like the mindset that shapes how people even approaching building in the first place?
I can't really narrow it down to a single factor because a lot of it is based on a confluence of factors. And a lot of the things that have impacted it have been accumulations over time, because the changes in a startup ecosystem are not things to where you can just flip of a light switch and all of a sudden the bulb turns on. These are things that are necessarily created over time, and it scales up. When you think about startup ecosystem, it has to scale up from the bottom. If you think about it as is essentially like building a pyramid, because we all know that the probability of creating a unicorn is a low percentage probability. Or because I'm not necessarily a big fan of the terminology unicorn. If we call it large scale successful outcome, it's a relatively low percentage. And that's basically the peak, the pinnacle of that pyramid. But in order to be able to increase our probabilities of generating those, we need to have progressively larger layers at each of the foundations beneath it. And that stems all the way back down to the layer of education. And I think that there is a need in order to push greater emphasis on STEM education specifically. If you look at neighboring country Vietnam, they've done a phenomenal job of creating probably one of the best talent pools of technical talent in Southeast Asia presently. And they've actually been a net exporter of talent because it's been a dev outsourcing center where a lot of outsourced development work has found its way over to Vietnam, similar to the way that Bangalore had been before its tech ecosystem really became massively vibrant. So we can anticipate similar is going to happen in that country. There's some things that are holding it back presently, but we need to be able to focus Malaysia needs to be able to focus greater emphasis on developing that talent pipeline domestically. And in the meantime, making the process of being able to import the talent more seamless. There are a number of things that they are currently doing in regards to the visa process for expatriate talent. I'm a beneficiary of it myself, so I do know that it is available, but you need to be able to create the domestic pipeline in conjunction with the foreign pipeline of talent. When you start getting beyond that, it's the supportive layers in regards to, are the grant making apparatus truly functioning to the benefit, or are they becoming a hindrance? Are they creating grantpreneurs, or are they truly having impact? None of this information is actually disclosed, so the only way to judge it is basically anecdotal on observation, because we don't have data in order to actually assess the way that that is actually taking place. But I can tell you anecdotally, from the time that I moved to Malaysia 8 years ago relative to today, I actually view the ecosystem as slightly less well off than it was when I arrived. That would indicate that there's a need in order to rework a lot of the way that things have taken place in the past. There's a lot of, I get confronted with a lot of bad advice that is pushed out into the market that may work in traditional businesses, but it doesn't necessarily work the same in technology businesses. That's a regular occurrence. There's other, without naming names, there's programs that are sponsored and funded in the ecosystem that are similarly culpable of putting out advice that is not, in my opinion, the applicable advice for scalable technology businesses. The funding ecosystem as well is problematic because it's overly dominated by a single source of capital, and there's not really truly a private sector filling in that gap. You have to leave in order to be able to tap into funds. And so all of that ends up creating, in combination, a limiting environment. And so when you look at the probabilities of what is my potential outcome, a lot of folks are fairly pragmatic and they want the safety and security of a paycheck as opposed to doing the high risk. But if we create more of an enabling environment, if we see some of the success of that, if we start being a little bit better and more thoughtful in our actions and how the results orientation of that is, I think that all of the enabling characteristics truly are there. This kind of circles back to the reason why I've become a little bit exhausted, as opposed to changing my true viewpoint. I've just become exhausted.
Yeah, I really appreciate you being raw on that. What touched me is that when you mentioned about we couldn't define the structural problem that appear from the ecosystem we are within by some of the words of some easy sentence, because it is not like sort of like a variables lead to a outcomes. It is like much of the variables that lead to a lot of outcomes.
A corporation ultimately will likely end up having the single overarching goal of let's increase profits. But just because you've set that as a goal, that's an outcome, not necessarily an action to influence it. And so when you think about this, when you look at organizations, oftentimes you'll have cascading layers of KPIs, the key performance indicators, measurable results that will essentially cascade down from senior leadership down to the middle layer, down to the lower layer, down to the individual contributor layer. And similarly, we need to take the same approach when thinking about the startup ecosystem as a whole, because we'll have different sets of indicators that all should be basically working in harmony in regards to the same way that we have a sales department, that we have maybe a manufacturing department, we've got HR, we've got these different departments. The same way, if we think about it from the concept, from the analogous viewpoint of a corporation, thinking about the impact of these individual departments or contributing factors into the startup ecosystem, there needs to be a stronger viewpoint around what are the measurable indicators of success. It honestly feels like we've been doing the same things, just with new slogans, and it doesn't appear to be working.
We touched about education is the most underlying one within the startup ecosystem. So I would like to zoom in into the education culture, because based on my own experience, I always hear things like, I will start my business after I work in corporates for a few years, or someone that studied computer science student saying that I choose this course because I used to play a lot of video games, but I don't have any idea why I'm coding now. And he or she end up becoming a corporate worker who intention is to leave the office on time every single working day. And what led me more frustrating is that parents still being a decision maker of what their child should study. A simple one from them like, you should study BA to make money in the future, study accounting to secure everyday meal for the whole life, study this and that to get this and that. That's bullshit. But sorry for being rude here. But I just wonder, from such education culture that we have now, do you think founders here are subconsciously trained to seek permission instead of taking initiative when approaching building in the first place?
Well, it's tough for me to judge, having not gone through the ecosystem of education and all of that. So the only way that I can comment is based upon the observations of the people that I interact with. But there seems to be a few different segments that I observe. There's the inherent cannots, where it's very sort of, if it's in the box of what I've been told and trained, this is the only thing that I am capable of doing. But in business, and especially in startups, nothing fits perfectly inside of a box. There is no cookie cutter situation. So by necessity, there needs to be this change in the thought process of cannot to how can. And that is one of the bigger things overarching, is teaching critical problem solving skills. Now, mind you, like there's a reason why there's a box, because there are rules associated with what can and should not be done. But I would draw a differentiation between should not and cannot. Cannot is a limitation in regards to perhaps don't know how, don't don't know why, don't know the process, just don't know. Whereas should not is something that potentially is either illegal, immoral, unethical, or otherwise something that should not be done. We need, obviously there's the should nots, and let's not touch that, but we need the critical problem solving skills in order to go after the can not. And we also need to start pushing towards a greater bias to action. Because if you're going to have any sort of entrepreneurial endeavor, you need to be able to have that bias to action, not the wait and see, not the wait for somebody to tell me, but you need to be able to have that bias to action. You know, what the way that I was kind of brought up in my career is I was empowered to do. It was expected that I did not bring a problem to my higher up and wait for them to tell me what to do. I was expected to solve the problem and then bring up the chain only if it surpassed my capabilities. And that's the way that I was able to grow and climb the ladder as well, is because I was a problem solver, not a problem bringer. And that's two very different types of employees. Nobody wants a problem bringer. Nobody wants the person that's constantly bringing him the problem, waiting to be told what to do. I want the person that is coming to me saying, look what I solved. Now everything's so much better for you. We need the problem solvers, which all comes back to these critical problem solving skills And a lot of that is where, some universities definitely excel at. Um, when you think about like case study models that certain universities have implemented, they're all geared towards trying to build that mentality. But that's only part of the equation because, obviously we can't ignore cultural dynamics in regards to power distance and these other sorts of aspects that naturally create this sort of hierarchical structure in regards to willingness to act and the bias to action. So I think we do need a bigger flip. But when you're in entrepreneurial environments, I think the general consensus amongst most founders is that they want employees, they want staff that have a bias to action. And so I think it's a great opportunity for anyone that already has that inherent mindset. Uh, Go get in with a startup, learn the ins and outs, and then start your own startup.
Yeah, that actually ties nicely into something that I want to mention about. Because based on my own observation, when we dive into how they design the activity books of the school or how they design all the flow of the learning to the students, I feel sort of like we are trained to be perfectionists at a certain point rather than to embrace uncertainty as a human nature when we're approaching something that value to solve about. So, and when we talk about build awareness starting from education, it naturally leads me to wonder about the bigger environment too, which is the institution and the policymakers as well. Because to be honest, I still don't have a clear big picture of what is really going on behind this whole phenomenon. I always says that the policymakers and those so-called tech corporates who are leading the charge, running programs to awaken the Malaysian startup ecosystem. We got MDC, the National AI Roadmap, along with government-backed VCs and so on, you name it. And on the surface, as we can see, everyone seems to be celebrating all of it. But deep down, my guts keep telling me something of that I just couldn't explain at the moment. So my question to you is, are these policymakers and corporate folks really equipped with an innovative mindset to push this forward? Or are they just riding the AI hype trend which lacking the nationality and that to actually make something meaningful out of it?
Yeah, so I think one of the big challenges is when you're talking about like top down from policy and corporate is a mindset change. Because I think that we all need to come to the realization that the different layers of finance, of investment, of innovation, they're not all the same. And the tactics that you would take for one could be harmful at the encouragement of the ecosystem for the other. And what I mean by that, to take an example, is if you think about investment terms and the approach to investment. If a person comes from a corporate mergers and acquisition or a banking background or a private equity background, the vast majority of those activities are very much one-off transactions. And so you can see it in the behavior in which they approach the transactions, and you can see it in the way that the terms of investment are done. Because essentially they're overloaded with risk mitigations and terms that are essentially loaded up on top of it because it's a one-off transaction. So you want to squeeze as much out of it as you can, but you want to protect your downside as much as you can. Uh, Now, if you were to take that exact same tactic with the company's first funding round at seed stage, you're basically going to load them up and make them unfundable because no one is going to want to follow that term sheet. You've basically poisoned the waters, and it's going to be very difficult for that same entrepreneur to find their way out again. And it happens very frequently. And it's not because of lack of good intention at the highest of level that came out with the idea of, hey, let's support startups. But the devil is in the details always. And so there needs to be an understanding of the nuance associated with the different layers of and the differences thereof of innovation and investing. And to be honest with you, the way of investing in a seed stage startup and the analysis that I would have to do is different than the analysis that somebody at Series A should and ought to be going through as well. And as that is actually different as well than the growth round stages of B, C, and beyond. They're different. And so if you approach them as the same, that's not a recipe for success. And so I think a lot of the challenge in my viewpoint is that when you bring around a lot of successful folks, they have a presumption of expertise in areas, even if it's new and nuanced, that is different. It just comes in with the same viewpoint, mindset, playbooks, etc. And we need to make sure that we're understanding the differentiation from one to the next, so that we're not necessarily shooting ourselves in the foot or creating unintended negative impacts of it. And to be perfectly blunt, I do believe that's probably partly at play in regards to some of my prior comments about the inefficacy of the efforts over the last, say, 10 years.
A follow-up question that out from the script. What do you mean by that is it we should have more smart capital to float our ecosystem to reduce the misalignment of incentive between the founders and the capital provider?
I mean, we could definitely use smarter capital, but I think we also need capital that has a broader mindset and viewpoint that is bringing in truly expertise and not just capital. Because there's this conflation of being a capital provider and being presumed to actually have expertise to advise the actual company, the actual founder. Those are not necessarily equated. And I think oftentimes there's a misunderstanding that just because somebody's coming in, that their say actually has value. Ideally, yes. Ideally, there are. We certainly try and be value additive in our advice and interactions at Indelible Ventures. And if you talk to our portfolio, they will vouch for our positive impact. But I think that there is a need in order to have more players that are bringing not just country specific perspectives, but regional perspectives, because one country is not large enough as a standalone, as an end destination. So by necessity, you have to have that broader context.
Yeah, thanks for being honest on that. So I just want to take a step back again to our discussion about the bureaucracy. Malaysian AI roadmap start from 2021, and this year come to at the end. So let's be honest here. Where's the real win? Since we are talking about how to apply automation every year instead of hearing about the progress, correct me if I'm wrong. I wonder where we at now, and what is your honest take on those fancy programs?
I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I can't point to a tangible impact where I say it's great that this was done because look at what happened. I mean, I can't unfortunately point to any outcomes. I see that there's a lot of activity, but I can't necessarily identify or point to any outcomes. There are certainly ones in regards to investments that are coming in from Google in regards to investing in data centers, AWS, Microsoft. But at the same time, most countries are getting those exact same ones. So oftentimes we hear in the local press and celebrating these investments, but most countries are getting the same.
Can I ask, because I came across a deep research on Malaysia AI roadmap, startup roadmap, and some achievement by them so far, like with success to increase government AI readiness index ranking. But how much those indicators are really matters to the startup ecosystem? Or is it another KPI indicators again? And most importantly, is it possible to get rid of number discussion back to the first principle of thinking, like how much are users satisfied from local software product, or how the builder's awareness has changed in the last 48 months? Are we able to really go back to that first principle perspective when we're approaching to the uh, building in the first place?
I'm not familiar with any startup that I'm directly engaged with or otherwise that. I mean, some of the startups I know have gotten government contracts, um, but I'm not familiar with any sort of like major outcome or otherwise. There's a handful of these sort of like support, kind of like what, in all honesty, when I talk to them, I kind of view it as more of like POCs that are in play, even though they may be large contracts. I still kind of see from my vantage point, at least, maybe I'm not the most inside knowledge on it. But a lot of it still seems like it's very sort of POC, proof of concept sort of stage, which is perfectly fine in order to be doing some experimentation. But again, I can't say that I've necessarily seen large tangible outcome. We do need emphasis and support on this. Um, it's encouraging to see that there's a push towards greater automation. But I mean, coming back to like first principles around building a vibrant startup ecosystem, we need to be layering up from the bottom, starting with skill sets, starting with the enabling environment, starting with the encouragement of ideation, creation of products, commercialization, and so there's a lot of layers that could benefit from greater emphasis.
If you had to measure the success of the AI roadmap by one honest metric or others programs, what would it be?
I mean, to be honest with you, I would have to segment it down because it would be hard to do one overarching. Um, I mean, in all honesty, I think most governments across the globe should be looking at increasing the amount of automation in the public sector and seeing how they can do more with less, because that's a direct impact into the taxes you pay. I pay taxes here in Malaysia as well. That's a direct impact in regards to where our tax dollars are going for, and if we can reduce the amount that has to go towards um, where, if we can improve the amount of automation, we can end up generating a lot of savings that can then be redirected perhaps to the Ministry of Education or some of these other sort of locations. And so I would be looking at from like a operations of the government. And I think, again, not Malaysia specific, but I think every single country in the globe should be looking at how much they can automate the processes and procedures as a way in order to improve the cost structure of government services. And so then either we can end up having reductions in taxes, or we can end up seeing some of those being redirected towards more beneficial long-term strategies like education. If we're looking at the startup ecosystem itself, again, I think we need to be able to layer up from the bottom of not just looking at gross number of startups, not just looking at the gross dollars of grants and investments that have gone out, but we actually need to look at outcomes based metrics of, let's call it, graduation rates. Are there those companies that are being supported graduating into subsequent layers of the stack, whether or not they're crossing milestones of, say, 1 million ARR USD terms, so I guess maybe 5 million ringgit ARR? Are they crossing the threshold from getting seed funding to Series A funding? Are they moving up the stack, essentially, whether from an operating performance or a VC funding pathway? Those metrics to me are more telling than X number of startups in the ecosystem, X number of dollars and grants distributed. That really doesn't tell me anything.
Yeah, that's a lot of unpack, and I need some time to digest it. But I want to zoom into the national direction for a second, because just now we mentioned about Dato Sri Anwar's presidency's leaderships. That is, there is a strong push to attract US big tech, as we can see. That is building data centers here, bringing capitals back in. And on paper, it looks exciting, but deep down, I worry that if our startup vision and founder support system are not aligned with this, so we might just end up being a low-cost infrastructure hub for LLMs rather than become an innovation-driven economy. So to conclude, we might become the back end of someone else's AI success story. So I'm glad if you would like to unpack for me to see whether I'm worrying too much on it.
No, I think what you bring up is a valid point. And I've heard people compare it to the semiconductor industry, to where even though Malaysia is an extremely important player in the global trade supply, that people argue that that Malaysia never really moved up the value chain in regards to its positioning, and that it just kind of became stuck there. And I think when you think about the building of the data centers and all of that, there is concern as well that will essentially fall into a similar sort of pathway where Singapore is the brains and Malaysia is the muscle. That we're simply a supplier of land and infrastructure needed in order for them to sustain, while we spend energy, water, etc., in order to be able to basically be the back end of it. And I think it's a valid concern. I think the way to combat that is not to worry so much about the infrastructure per se. I think the infrastructure is a comparative advantage because it's right in our back door. The big thing that needs to take place is coming back again to that layering up from the bottom. We need to start pushing on sooner rather than later on all of the educational structures that we need in order to have world-class talent base that comes out and moves from the back office to the front office and is the ones that are creating the innovations. And if we have all of the infrastructure right in the backyard, it should position you for that. It's not easy, and it takes a long-term mindset, because we may be talking 5, 15, 20 years of consistent effort in developing that pipeline, because it's, part of it is like tackling today's kindergartners and getting the focus from like the earliest of like school age. I was at an event over the weekend, and they put up the statistics that young people 15 to 30 make up about 1/3 of Malaysia's population. Within that population, there's enough time, there's enough ability, there's enough capability, mindfulness, etc., that we can skill up that segment of the population to become the leaders of the next decade. It's just a matter of willingness to roll up the sleeves and start thinking of it from what are the skills, what are the deployments, how can we end up positioning them. There's nothing wrong as well with many of these folks getting jobs in with some of the MNCs, doing placements overseas or otherwise, because that's all broadening the mindset. The key thing is creating the ecosystem that makes somebody want to come back and make somebody want to build from here. Too often times, Malaysia's number one export is its talent.
I want to shift gears a little bit into your approach at Indelible Ventures.
Yeah.
You specifically target seed stage, tech-enabled B2B startups that can scale internationally. What drives this approach?
I think Malaysia makes a fertile ground to build B2B tech startups. When I look at the countries that we prioritize, because we invest across Southeast Asia, when I look at the countries that we prioritize, I really want to see where we can define a number of types of global linkages that the country has. Now, for example, these global linkages may be where the multinational corporations are putting the bulk of their operations. Maybe they put a marquee address in Singapore, but the bulk of the employees may not be there. They may be in Malaysia. Maybe there's manufacturing plants in Thailand. The key thing is where are where do they want to go? Where do those corporations want to go? Because that's who we're selling to in B2B tech. Where are the trade supply linkages strongest? Which countries have histories of offshoring, outsourcing? Where do we have young digitally savvy talent bases? Where can we end up having a low cost labor force? Maybe not the lowest, but where can we have reasonable economics on our cost structure so that we can iterate and scale? And I think from a lot of that, Malaysia is very strong across those categories. And so it's a fertile ground for B2B tech. Now, the challenge with any market that would be still considered a nascent ecosystem is that oftentimes you're dealing with first time or second time founders. And so in my opinion, with first time and second time founders, they often need more than just the capital. They need advice, they need infrastructure, they need connections, they need a sounding board even, or maybe there's a number of different characteristics and needs that they may end up having, but they frequently need more than capital. And so that's where kind of smart money aspect comes in. It doesn't necessarily mean that the person knows more about their business than them. It just means I've seen 1,000 companies. Let me tell you what I've seen so that you as the founder can then take that and run with it. That's more of the difference. And so those are kind of the two layers of why our approach is. I think there's certain countries that are naturally well suited for early stage B2B, that are nearby their customers, that have linkages in order to get that start, that have cost base that make it more palatable and easier to iterate and scale. But it needs a more hands-on approach because it's a nascent ecosystem and that there's a need for more than just capital.
And since we've talked a lot about the ecosystem and the capital landscape, I want to ask something more direct about the reality of managing a fund here in emerging markets. So you are managing venture funds based and focused on the emerging market. So can we be blunt here? What challenges you are facing specifically, all the way from fundraising from LPs, choosing the right founders, lead your partner company to grow, and eventually realizing returns to LPs? And most importantly, how do you counter those challenges?
So there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll start from through the chain
Oh yeah,
the
sure.
chain of events. Raising LP capital is a challenge no matter what. Every LP, every institutional or high net worth family office, they have a lot of options of where they can invest. I may think that I have the prettiest baby, but there's a lot of other options out there. Now, couple that with the aspect of I'm focused on a market that in the global context is considered a niche. And because also, I'm even further focused on kind of non-typical geographies within Southeast Asia, that's even further a niche. And I'm not even just a generalist, I'm focused on B2B, so that's even further a niche. So I do have an issue with that. I'm a niche within a niche within a niche within a niche. So there's an inherent challenge around that, but that's also part of my value proposition in regards to how we differentiate. We're unique in regards to our approach, etc. So it's certainly a challenging market. It's also a challenge in that Southeast Asia has not had much success with exits, and so the liquidity of the funds that were my predecessors, on average, has not been that good. So you also get a lot of the investors in some of those past funds that, they tried it, they didn't like it, they didn't get money, so now they're kind of burnt on the idea of venture. So there's an inherent challenge around getting enough interest. But the same way with a startup, you have to go and ask enough, and ultimately your thesis is going to resonate with enough people. If fundraising was easy, everybody would have an ample amount of money and could just go around. Fundraising is never easy. You have to have a value proposition that fits with what your audience, in my case, limited partners, what they actually want. Now, once I do aggregate this capital, there's a challenge around deploying it because, again, nascent markets don't have the same level of visibility in regards to who are up and coming. When you think of markets like the US, they're very robust markets. You have a lot more visibility because there's a lot more coverage, and you have a lot more data and metrics that are monitoring everything that's going on. That's also part of our value proposition because I'm very heavily on the ground in the markets that we prioritize. So I have a good network of community across the startup ecosystems where I'm active. And because I've been active in these ecosystems for a long time, there's a very strong referral network. I oftentimes say that smart people know other smart people. So the more smart people you know, the more second degree connections of smart people you will find. And so I'm constantly out there trying to meet and get to know and befriend and be value additive with and give without asking in order to develop that network, because that just creates a more robust network for myself. So that gets you onto the sourcing of how to actually find the companies, of really getting on the ground. The selecting is a challenge because, in venture, we oftentimes say you have to source, select, and service. Selecting is more on, now that you've sourced deals, how do you choose which ones are the ones to do? And I think for me, it comes to the unique viewpoint that I've developed over a very long career across the globe, across industries, and across stages, that I'm able to see things that other people may not be able to see. I may have a viewpoint or a perspective that not everyone may end up having. And I can share that downstream with the companies and better understand where I might be able to see them fit in a regional or a global context. Now, on the servicing, this comes back to the aspect in regards to the value add that startups need. This is the post-investment. How am I then interacting with them? And this is essentially our approach is scaled up or scaled down based upon the way that the individual companies need us. Because again, I'm not the expert on any particular company. I'm a capital provider and a minority capital provider at that. The founders are the leaders of the show. My job is to provide as much advice and guidance that they can find useful without getting in their way. And we do this in a number of different capacities, but oftentimes, because I'm more of a finance guy, it has a tendency of coming down to helping them manage around their metrics, manage around their finances, manage around their cash burn, and leverage all of that data into better strategic decision making in finding their pathway to product market fit, repeatable go-to-market strategies, and ultimately scaling. So that's the servicing. And then the last aspect, I'll throw out a fourth S letter term to go along with the source select service, which is sell. Now, on the sell side, Southeast Asia does not have the best track record of exits. There are some, there's just not enough. So there's a lot of paper value on the books of a lot of VCs out there. And so selling is a challenge. My personal viewpoint on this is that I do not have faith or belief that IPOs are a high probability outcome. I don't see the IPO markets in Southeast Asia as being strong contenders in the present moment that could facilitate tech companies looking at them as serious options for liquidity. There's a lot of efforts by all of the governments around the region to try and change that. But from the present time period, I think that the biggest hindrance is not necessarily on regulation, it's on who are the participants. Most of the participants, that when you look across these markets, are the very traditional government pension funds and very sort of traditional institutions that want traditional businesses that have traditional cash flows, that look, feel familiar, and tech is something new. So unless we can start seeing a shift in that mindset, I don't necessarily see IPO markets being viable. And the likelihood of going into international ones, of going into Hong Kong, Tokyo, Australia, US, London, a lot of the team members of each of those exchanges, they're all over Southeast Asia trying to convince people to list in their markets. Um, but ultimately, what it comes down to is their liquidity when the lockup period ends and you can actually start trying to exit out of it. And generally speaking, it's not very good for the companies here. So if that's a low probability, where do I see as the high probability? I see high probability of trying to position companies for M&A activity as the primary pathway. Now, this is much more nuanced than in consumer tech, because consumer tech is very much of a winner take all or winner take most sort of market. So you always have to think about, well, who's the next buyer? And as you get bigger and bigger, there become fewer and fewer buyers. And when you're in consumer, it's even fewer and fewer because of the inherent characteristic of winner take all or winner take most. But in B2B, it's quite different, that inherent characteristic, because oftentimes there's enough of a size and space within a category to have multiple category winners. And so what we see much more frequently is that M&A is much higher probability in the B2B space than in the consumer space because of that exact characteristic. It's not a winner take all. There's room for multiple category winners. Now, the challenge there, when we think about it in the context of Southeast Asia, comes back again to that who's the next buyer thought process. And the larger you get, the fewer and fewer options you have. How many companies can acquire $1 billion entity? Not very many. The way that we view Southeast Asia presently is that there really aren't acquirers at that large size, and that the acquirers that are going to come around are really going to be at what we would consider in the US as a lower mid cap, which would be, say, 50 to 250 million US dollars size of exit. And so that's the area that we try and position, and it's oftentimes starts early. Acquisitions don't happen out of thin air. They oftentimes develop out of relationships that have been nurtured and established for very long periods of time. Maybe it's a strategic partnership. Maybe it's a toe in the water investment to see how it would go. Maybe they're a customer. Maybe there's other sort of reasons. But oftentimes these things don't happen out of thin air. They have to be creatively developed, nurtured, and worked towards, not only by the founders, but oftentimes by the investors that are behind it.
I came across from Ben Torsell, which is one of the internet entrepreneurs based in the US, who advocates that in AI startups, product velocity isn't just a competitive advantage anymore. It is existential. We are not raising other startups, but instead we are raising models, improvements themselves, since the velocity of the models being commoditized and depreciated is exponentially higher day to day. So I would like to ask, how should founders think about product building when the baseline tech they are building on is evolving faster than their own development cycles?
Yeah, I mean, this is a tough one, because when you look at the foundational models, there's a very high capex that has gone into them. And the degradation of the models, the cycles by which new models are released, is becoming so fast. They essentially said that they want to release a new model every month or something crazy like that.
Yeah.
It's hard to compete with those, because those players are essentially a capex race. But they're essentially laying the foundations to it. So I kind of view a lot of that as a layer that is going to end up becoming commoditized. The same way that, in all honesty, data centers for the most part are fairly commoditized within certain viewpoints. Obviously, some differentiation in regards to the types of chips that they're using, etc. But it's a massive capex expenditure in order to establish, and they're relatively undifferentiated from one to the next in regards to that base service. Most of them differentiate in regards to the ancillary services that they add on top of it. What does AWS add on top? What does Google add on top, etc.? That, in my opinion, is going to be where we ultimately, in the long term, go with the foundational models. Is I think that there's going to end up being a commoditization, consolidation, and that there's going to be a relative lack of differentiation. We've already absorbed most of the world's data and knowledge to the point to where we're using synthetic data now to train models. We're past the point of some of the proprietary data sets. And so that ends up creating an inherent challenge. But I think that there's a very big opportunity for startups in this space, because enterprise users of the technology, they don't move nearly as fast as the way the technology has been moving. So when you think about large corporates, they don't do dramatic changes month after month. For them to make a dramatic change is a serious thing. And so we need to keep into context that adoption side of the equation on when we're thinking about the direction of technology. And so I do believe that there is a large opportunity for companies to build products that are tackling real workflow issues that these corporates are having. And AI may be the front of the product, or it may be something that is just enabling you to make your product so much better, faster, cheaper, that it becomes a better sale and the economics become improved. But in the long run, I think that there's probably going to be a lot of money lost on those foundational layers, just because massive amounts of billions and billions going into that.
A follow-up question, because since you mentioned about the dramatic change of the infrastructure of the AI models, only will happens when on the serious things, or when the founders need to seek some breakthroughs in terms of the differentiation of product. Because I've spoken to a local founder recently, he advocates that if there is little or no code written about machine learning algorithms behind a product, but if the customer's problem solved by the product itself is large enough and the value created is large enough, then it will be valuable as well. To be honest, I take it with a grain of salt. So what do you think of this statement?
It's hard to say, because I can imagine a few pathways that the ecosystem is going to end up taking. But I do think, circling back to the comment about the commoditization, if we take that as a likely outcome and that becomes commoditized, there's still enough room for value creation to happen at the application layer. I just think that the application layer is going to look differently than what it did previously. Now, we're still early days, so I haven't kind of settled on what my thesis for the long term looks like. But we have this instance where our interface may end up changing, because I don't know if you've played around with any voice AI or voice to text in the past, but that's improving rather substantially. So what if, instead of me having keyboard and mouse, now I'm simply doing dictation? Like, think of like the Iron Man movie with Jarvis, and I just have a personal assistant bot that I'm just prompting it to do what I want it to do while we're interacting in like this virtual lab setup. I think like a lot of science fiction can turn into science reality, but ultimately there's a number of layers: vertical AI, AI agents, agentic AI. There's a lot of layers that are still open for opportunities. So if somebody's building, there's a lot of value capture still out there. I think that in some of the ones that can become more automated, we're going to see a compression of margin on things that are basically just simple databases with a wrapper on it.
In the previous podcast, you and Mike Helfman, one of our local podcaster, discuss how AI tools can make filmmaking cheaper. but also risk removing the emotional core. I have a curiosity on it. Do you think we are heading toward a world where audience stop caring who made the story as long as it entertains them?
I think so. To be honest with you, I think that there was a movie that was put out and claiming to be the first AI movie. It was not very good in my opinion. I wasn't so impressed. It seemed like they were just trying to catch on to some hype, but that's just my opinion. But I do think in the long run, I mean, if I look at my own taste, I love action movies, and action movies are more and more CGI, computer graphic imagery. Um, and so, if we're already using computer graphic imagery to create these sort of scenes, is it that much of a stretch of imagination that the majority of the movie could then also be made leveraging the same technology? And if we can come to that conclusion, can we also then say that we can, instead of having to key and encode every single scene and every single frame, that we can then simply use prompting to facilitate the creation of movies? And if they entertain, is that not sufficient? And one of the other things that I brought up with them, which was kind of like hypothesizing of whether or not it's feasible, could we not get to the point to where we could have a level of personalization to where, let's say you're a giant Star Wars fan, but you haven't liked the series that have been coming out on Disney Hotstar, so you want to be able to program your own. Maybe there's an extra license fee that you would actually have to pay to Disney to like do fan fiction and create your own. But I can imagine a possible world where you'll be empowered with the tools to create your own. I wish the ending of this series would have been slightly different. I wonder what it would look like if it did it.
Yeah.
That level of personalization, I think, is probably somewhere in the future. So I do think that filmmaking, entertainment, uh, whether we're talking about television series on Netflix or whatever, or we're talking about blockbuster movies, I think we're going to see a big paradigm change in that respect. But let's be honest, you know, I can draw on a piece of paper, but I'm not an artist. I can get some cool tools, but I don't necessarily have the same. I'm never going to be a Picasso. I'm never going to create a movie and have the viewpoint of like a Scorsese or name your phenomenal director. There is always going to be a space for the creative genius that creates the content that we currently like. I think the means by which we're creating it are changing, and then the need for greater differentiation, so that I'm choosing something that's created by an artist as opposed to something that I'm prompting to create, I think is going to end up becoming greater and greater.
Yeah. In my opinion, there's a trade-off there. Like prompt engineering, they unlock the potential of the creation of the like movies or something else in the sense of personalization and with the human nature. I think there's a trade-off there. But I just want to curious about how we should define the meaning of life, since as we mentioned, the meaning of life used to underline with human contribution on the value creation in the past, but seems the determination of meaning of life by the human contribution is keep reducing all the day by day. So I wanted to ask how we should define the meaning of life given this.
That definition changes over time. So like if we flash back to caveman time period, the meaning of life was what? Hunt and gather, survive. Now with more tools and technology in the Renaissance period, the meaning of life would have changed. I think you come to today, you come to the future. I think it's more on It always comes back to a subjective definition of purpose, um, and how that purpose fits in more broadly within our social slash community networks. People will view that differently because each individual is going to have their own viewpoint. But technology changes it without doubt.
I would like to dive into the quickfire questions. Ready to go?
Yep.
All right. So first quickfire question: market first or founder first?
Founder first.
What if the market is too good that seems irresistible, but the founder didn't meet your expectations? How do you manage?
Great founders, if great founders will find a great market, bad founders can fail in great markets. Ultimately, no matter what you're building, you have to iterate over time. And if you're not a good founder, I'm not sure whether or not you're going to be able to manage that.
Spray and pray or high conviction on few?
High conviction. I think the math is much harder to make work when you're looking at spray and pray. We just don't have the size of outcomes in Southeast Asia for that strategy to work. And even in markets that do have more liquidity, I see that that's been breaking down as well.
What is your non-negotiable in life or work?
A non-negotiable. Well, there's two things. One non-negotiable is time with my family, and the second non-negotiable is I won't jeopardize my integrity or principles.
The same as me. Family is the first. As always.
Family
Yeah.
is first. I mean, both
Yeah.
of those kind of fit together. Both of those non-negotiables basically fit together because my integrity and my principles revolve around my family. But they also have a broader reach into what am I willing to support and what am I not willing to support.
What personal traits are very important to you but might be a little hard for others to understand?
Yeah, I like bluntness, and sometimes it can come off as abrasive. I think I have a tendency of turning some people off because I have a tendency of saying exactly what I think, and I'm not very good at sugarcoating. I like that because everything needs to move. I have a bias to action, so I don't see the necessity in wasting time with the kind of the cloak and dagger of trying to spare feelings.
I totally agree on that. Sugarcoating is shit. And time, yeah. And we should consider that time is a very important factor of production, no matter what job we are doing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, what is your go-to move when you feel overwhelmed?
If I'm feeling overwhelmed, I like to exercise. To be honest with you, it's a stress relief. When I release some of like the aggression of feeling stuck, there's something about the dopamine release that gets me ready to play, ready to get back at it, and it also helps clear my mind because like it's hard to focus on the problems when I'm focused on like focused on something else.
The very last one, Kevin. If a 20 years old builder in Malaysia asks you, at this moment, should I go all in on building tech company? What will your advice be?
So that's a little bit tough. So generally, I would encourage most anyone to jump into the entrepreneur lifestyle. Um, but I would caveat that with I think that a lot of people would benefit from working at a startup first so that they can see the inner workings and get an understanding of the operational flow of like a truly fast growing startup and the demands that come of it, because if you've done that, it's not drastically dissimilar to I think it was Jack Ma a long time ago when Alibaba was first having a lot of its major success. He basically said similar: go work for somebody, learn it, and then go do it yourself while you're still young enough in order to reset in case it doesn't work out. Now, mind you, I would say like older generation entrepreneurs actually have very high success rates. So I wouldn't discourage older folks from being entrepreneurs either. Your 40-year-old entrepreneurs are actually quite successful. But for a young person, I'd probably say no problem doing it as long as you have the safety net and I think you have the motivation. But if you're still trying to decide what it is you want to do in regards to entrepreneurship, go join a startup, develop some understanding from the inside out, and that will help you kind of spin out and do it yourself.
Yeah, I like how you advocate that. What is important when to dive into the startup ecosystem? The startup is we need to be sort of like we need to be more hunger and
Yeah, you got to be hungry.
Be dumb and be humble at the same time, which I think is very difficult, but it is worth to learn for our personal growth at a certain point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
agree.
Yes. So listen, Kevin, I value your time and effort for making this happen. I really loving doing this, and thank you so much for joining me. And you've been a very fantastic guest.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much.